Audit procedures when non-compliance is identified or suspected. If the auditor becomes aware of the information concerning an instance of non-compliance or suspected non-compliance with laws or regulations, the auditor shall obtain an understanding of the nature of the act and the circumstances in which it has occurred. And the auditor shall obtain further information to evaluate the possible effect on the financial statements. If the auditor suspects there may be non-compliance, the auditor shall discuss the matter with management and where appropriate TCWG. If management or as appropriate TCWG do not provide sufficient information that supports that the entity is in compliance with laws and regulations, and in the auditor's judgment the effect of the suspected non-compliance may be material to the financial statements, the auditor shall consider the need to obtain legal advice. If sufficient information about suspected non-compliance cannot be obtained, the auditor shall evaluate the effect of the lack of sufficient appropriate audit evidence on the auditor's opinion. The auditor shall evaluate the implications of non-compliance in relation to other aspects of the audit, including the auditor's risk assessment and reliability of written representations, and take appropriate action. Reporting of identified or suspected non-compliance. Reporting of non-compliance to those charged with governance. Unless all of TCWG is involved in management of the entity and therefore are aware of the matters involved, identified or suspected non-compliance already communicated by the auditor shall communicate the TCWG matters involving non-compliance with laws and regulations that come to the auditor's attention during the course of the audit, other than when the matters are clearly inconsequential. If in the auditor's judgment the non-compliance referred to above is believed to be intentional and material, the auditor shall communicate the matter to those TCWG as soon as practicable. If the auditor suspects that the management or TCWG are involved in non-compliance, the auditor shall communicate the matter to the next higher level of authority at the entity if it exists, such as an audit committee or supervisory board, etc. Where no such higher authority exists, or if the auditor believes that the communication may not be acted upon, or he is very much unsure as to the person to whom he should report such non-compliance, the auditor shall consider the need to obtain legal advice. Reporting non-compliance in the auditor's report on the financial statements. If the auditor concludes that non-compliance has a material effect on the financial statements, again I repeat, if the auditor concludes that the non-compliance has a material effect on the financial statements and has not been adequately reflected in the financial statements, the auditor shall, in accordance with SA 705, express a qualified or adverse opinion on the financial statements. If the auditor is precluded by the management or TCWG from obtaining sufficient appropriate audit evidence to evaluate whether non-compliance that may be material to the financial statements has or is likely to have occurred, the auditor shall express a qualified opinion or disclaim an opinion on the financial statements on the basis of a limitation on the scope of audit in accordance with SA 705. If the auditor is unable to determine whether non-compliance has occurred because of the limitations imposed by the circumstances rather than by the management or those charged with governance, the auditor shall evaluate the effect on the auditor's opinion in accordance with SA 705. I repeat, if the auditor is unable to determine whether non-compliance has occurred because of limitations imposed by the circumstances rather than by the management or TCWG, the auditor shall evaluate the effect on the auditor's opinion in accordance with SA 705. Reporting the non-compliance to regulatory and enforcement authorities. If the auditor has identified or suspects non-compliance with laws and regulations, the auditor shall determine whether the auditor has a responsibility to report the identified or suspected non-compliance to parties outside the entity. Documentation. The auditor shall document identified or suspected non-compliance with laws and regulations and the results of discussion with management and where applicable TCWG and other parties outside the entity. Test your understanding. Number 3. FAC Insurance Brokers Limited is a leading online insurance intermediary. During the year, the Director General of GST Intelligence DGGI has issued notice to the company for allegedly creating fictitious invoices for marketing and sales service amounting to 50 crores in favor of non-life insurance companies. The premises of company were also searched during the year by DGGI officials. The matter was also informed to IRDAI by DGGI for violation of norms and regulations in this regard. Does above situation has any bearing on your responsibilities as a statutory auditor of the company? Outline briefly in the context of possible non-compliance with laws by the company. With this, we are finishing essay 250, and the next the next segment is essay 260, which is communication with those charged with governance. Essay 260 deals with the auditor's responsibility to communicate with TCWG in an audit of financial statements. Who are TCWG? TCWG denote person or organizations or corporate trustee with responsibility for overseeing the strategic direction of the entity and obligations related to the accountability of the entity. This includes those overseeing the financial reporting process. For some entities, TCWG may include management personnel, for example, executive members of the governance board of a private or public sector entity, or an owner manager. Governance structure vary by entities, reflecting influences such as different cultural and legal backgrounds, size and ownership characteristics. For example, in some entities, a supervisory board exists that is separate from the executive board. In other entities, both supervisory and the executive functions are performed by a single board. In some entities, those charged with governance hold positions that are integral part of the entity's legal structure. For example, company directors. In some cases, some or all of TCWG are involved in the managing the entity. In others, TCWG and management comprise different persons. In most entities, governance is a collective responsibility of a governing body such as board of directors, supervisory board, partners, proprietors, a committee of management, trustees, or equivalent persons. In some smaller entities, however, one person may be charged with governance, for example, the owner manager, where there are no other owners or a sole trustee. Such diversity means that it is impossible to specify for all audits the persons with whom the auditor is to communicate particular matters. Also, in some cases, the appropriate persons with whom to communicate may not be clearly identifiable from the applicable legal framework or other engagement circumstances. For example, entities where the governance structure is not formally defined, such as some family-owned entities, some non-profit organization. In such cases, auditor may need to discuss and agree with the engaging party the relevant persons with whom to communicate. In deciding with whom to communicate, the auditor's understanding of an entity's governance structure and processes obtained in accordance with Essay 315 is relevant. The appropriate persons with whom to communicate may vary depending on the matter to be communicated. Significance of communication with TCWG. Communication from the auditor is very important with TCWG. An effective two-way communication is important in assisting the auditor and those charged with governance in understanding matters related to the audit in context and in developing a constructive working relationship. This relationship is developed while maintaining the auditor's independence and objectivity. The auditor, in obtaining from those charged with governance information relevant to the audit. For example, TCWG may assist the auditor in understanding the entity and its environment, in identifying appropriate sources of audit evidence, and in providing information about specific transactions or events, and TCWG in fulfilling their responsibility to oversee the financial reporting process, thereby reducing the ROMM of the financial statements. Objectives of auditor in accordance with SA 260. The objectives of the auditor are to communicate clearly with TCWG responsibilities of the auditor in relation to the financial statement audit and an overview of the planned scope and timing of the audit. To obtain from those charged with governance information relevant to the audit. To provide TCWG with timely observations arising from the audit that are significant and relevant to their responsibility to oversee the financial reporting process, and to promote effective two-way communication between the auditor and those charged with governance. Objectives of the auditor: to communicate clearly with TCWG responsibilities of the auditor in relation to the financial statement audit and an overview of the planned scope and timing of the audit. To obtain from TCWG information relevant to the audit. To obtain TCWG, to provide TCWG with timely observations arising from the audit that are significant and relevant to their responsibility to oversee the financial reporting process, and to promote effective two-way communication between the auditor and those charged with governance. Determine appropriate persons with whom to communicate. The auditor shall determine the appropriate persons within the entity's governance structure with whom to communicate. I repeat, the auditor shall communicate with TCWG the responsibilities of the auditor in relation to the financial statement audit, including that the auditor is responsible for forming and expressing an opinion on the financial statements that have been prepared by management with the oversight of TCWG. The audit of the financial statements does not relieve the management or TCWG with governance of their responsibilities. The auditor's responsibilities in relation to the financial statement audit are often included in the engagement letter or other suitable format of written agreement that records the agreed terms of engagement. Law, regulation, or the governance structure of the entity may require those charged with governance to agree to the terms of engagement with the auditor. When this is not the case, providing TCWG with a copy of that engagement letter or other suitable form of written agreement may be an appropriate way to communicate with them. Planned scope and timing of the audit. Communication regarding the planned scope and timing of the audit may assist TCWG to understand better the consequences of the auditor's work, to discuss issues of risk and concept of materiality with the auditor, and to identify any areas in which they may request the auditor to undertake additional procedures, and assist the auditor to understand better the entity and its environment. I repeat, planned scope and timing of the audit. Communication regarding the planned scope and timing of the audit may assist the TCWG to understand better the consequences of the auditor's work, to discuss issues of risk and concept of materiality with the auditor, and to identify any areas in which they may request the auditor to undertake additional procedures, and assist the auditor to understand better the entity and its environment. The auditor shall communicate with TCWG an overview of the planned scope timing of the audit, which includes communicating about significant risk identified by the auditor. Communicating significant risk identified by the auditor helps TCWG understand those matters and why they require special audit consideration. The communication about significant risk may assist TCWG in fulfilling their responsibility to oversee the financial reporting process. While communication with TCWG may assist the auditor to plan the scope and timing of the audit, it doesn't change the auditor's sole responsibility to establish the overall audit strategy and the audit plan, including the nature, timing, and extent of audit procedures necessary to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence. Care is necessary when communicating with TCWG about the planned scope and timing of the audit so as not to compromise the effectiveness of the audit, particularly where some or all of TCWG are involved in managing the entity. For example, communicating the nature and timing of detailed audit procedures may reduce the effectiveness of those procedures by making them too predictable. Significant findings from the audit. The auditor shall communicate with TCWG the auditor's views about significant qualitative aspects of the entity's accounting practices, including accounting policies, accounting estimates, and financial statement disclosures. When applicable, the auditor shall explain to TCWG why the auditor considers a significant accounting practice that is acceptable under the applicable FRF not to be most appropriate to the particular circumstances of the entity. Significant difficulties, if any, encountered during the audit. Significant difficulties encountered during the audit. Unless all of TCWG are involved in the unless all of those charged with governance are involved in managing the entity, significant matters arising during the audit that were discussed or subject to correspondence with management, written representations the auditor is requesting. Unless all of those charged with governance are involved in managing the entity, significant matters arising during the audit that were discussed or subject to correspondence with management, written representations the auditor is requesting. Circumstances that affect the form and content of the auditor's report, if any other significant matters arising during the audit that in the auditor's professional judgment are relevant to the oversight of the financial reporting process. The communication of findings from the audit may include requesting further information from those charged with governance in order to complete the audit evidence obtained. For example, the auditor may confirm that TCWG have the same understanding of the facts and circumstances relevant to the specific transactions or events. So, the communication of findings from the audit may include requesting further information from TCWG. The communication of findings from the audit may include requesting further information from TCWG in order to complete the audit evidence obtained. For example, auditor may confirm that TCWG have the same understanding of the facts and circumstances relevant to specific transactions or events. Significant difficulties encountered during the audit may include such matters as